Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. And I hope you're ready to listen to part 2 of our story, a very exciting story. But before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And if you haven't heard part 1 of the story, I do advise you to go back because it would be an awful pity to miss out on the whole story. So let's continue with our story, shall we? James recalls a night of drunken, outrageous madness when he and his friends had become so smashed and inebriated as they chatted up some spirited young woman from town. Their hormones were charged with a lascivious, unbridled passion that escalated into heavy petting between strangers. But in this drunken, frenzied, lustful revelry, the morals of an alley cat were welcomed gladly, while integrity was willfully abandoned, rejected to the back seat. Amber had successfully seduced James. His inhibitions had been thrown to the wayside, his self-control not restrained. It hadn't taken much for Amber to lure him back to her farmhouse, assuring the young man that her parents were away and that they would have the entire place to themselves. "Don't be such a wet blanket. Go on, it'll be fun," she had assured him. "My sister's in her bedroom, fast asleep. She won't wake up. No one else is here." He barely remembers that shadowy night, where alcohol had knocked his senses far away. Suppressed indeterminate memories that were dulled into a hazy, nebulous blur, when even faces became veiled in a clouded, enigmatic obscurity, while the elusive, impalpable memories of that night are rather like a soaked letter, where the ink runs away, the paper becomes mushy, and you can make no sense of any of it at all. The impressions of his photographic recall of that night are shapelessly dull, vague, blurry. Yet he does remember the awkward discomfort and shameful horror of waking up in a perfect stranger's house and freaking out. It must have been about 7 in the morning when he climbed out of a stranger's bed and realised he wasn't actually at home. He was lying in an unfamiliar woman's bed, her hair strewn over her dented pillow like a blonde, messy curtain. He barely remembered a thing at all. In horror, he glances down at his naked body, with a measure of self-disgust and revulsion. The evidence of his night of passion is seen in the pool of clothes puddled all over the floor, along with the young woman's lingerie. James feels nauseously sick to the stomach. It eclipses the back of his throat, and like a deer caught in headlights, he quickly dresses as discreetly and clandestinely as possible. He rockets out of the house faster than a shooting star, grotesquely ashamed of his lack of self-control that had landed him in the stew pot. He was better than this. What the hell was he thinking? His behaviour last night was outrageous. It was a couple of weeks later in town, when an unfamiliar figure comes stomping up the street, with a look so ferocious it would have scared off a Rottweiler. At first he didn't recognise her. It was Amber. He's walking with his 2 friends side by side. One of his friends pipes, "Who's that woman, with the dagger looks, marching towards us with murder on her mind? She's one hell of a scary woman." In a trice, like a tornado, the feisty, pugnacious woman, wearing cowboy boots and a tunic dress, comes belligerently marching up to the 3 men. She thunders towards James, thrusting her knee in the air, kicking into his groin forcefully with such a powerful punch. He recoils in a crippling, agonizing pain, his torso buckling over his knees, his legs crossing, his face flushing a bright pink. That was one hell of a hard kick. "Bloody hell, woman! That bloody hurt! What is your problem?" "Good! You deserved that. You came home with me, James. You used me. You dumped me. Men like you make me sick to my stomach. I don't appreciate being used and spat out like that." She spits at James. Her frothy spittle lands on his jacket. Then she stomps away. The bemused men stare silently after her. The angry woman seems to gallop over the sidewalk, like an incandescent bison, thundering across the open plains, lifting up the red earth in its indignation. For a while, no one says a single thing, as if the strange, incongruous moment is so bizarre that it takes a moment to fully assimilate its sobering impact.
Bloody hell, James! What did you do to her? Whatever you did, you really upset her most grievously. You should be careful who you go home with, James. That woman is clearly a shark with stiletto teeth. She could eat you alive for breakfast if you're not careful. That woman should come with a warning sign. Don't touch. Exceedingly poisonous. Very dangerous. You're not kidding, says James.
Back here in the festive atmosphere of the Hemingways' cosy living room, surrounded by the animated, pleased expressions of Pearl's parents, James feels as if he's been flung from a celebratory pot of sweet honey, directly into the firing line of the capricious figure of Amber Hemingway. Could this really be happening to him? James quickly draws in a deep breath as Amber meets his eyes gleefully. There's a delighted smirk on her face, a cocky, arrogant, defiant look that says, "I'm going to eat you alive, young man, and tear your life to shreds. See if I don't." Pleased to meet you, James. Why is it that I have the sneaky feeling that we've met somewhere before? I do wonder where that could be. You think you've met James before? Says Mrs. Hemingway. How extraordinary. Well, I suppose it's a very small world. You're not kidding about that, Mother. How about I go and make everybody a lovely cup of tea to celebrate this exciting news? Congratulations, sister dear. You've landed yourself quite some catch in James here, she says sarcastically. James pretends to require an ablution break. He scampers quickly to the kitchen. Amber looks up at him in surprise as she's preparing the tea tray for everyone. Oh, it's you. Why doesn't that surprise me at all? You're scared I'm going to tell my little sister what you're really like, are you?
Look, Amber, I know what I did that night was not good, and I apologise for it. I was drunk and inebriated. Yes, I came home with you. I'm ashamed because I have no memory of the event. When I woke up in the morning to find myself in your bed, I was mortified. That is why I did a panicky runner, I'm afraid. But I would truly appreciate your discretion in regards to this matter. I would be grateful if you didn't tell your sister about any of this, or what happened between us. It's not that I want to keep secrets from her, but I know if she thought we'd spent a night together, even though it happened long before I met her, I think it would cause her unnecessary, undue, grievous hurt, which she does not deserve. I'm in love with your sister, and I don't want to hurt her. She's delicate. She's precious. She means the world to me. So I was just a little roll in the hay for you, was I? Another notch to your bedpost? You make me sick. Men like you make me sick, the whole lot of you. I think Pearl deserves to know what a snake in the grass she's actually marrying, don't you? Well, then I'm going to have to tell her what happened from my perspective, says James, as you don't actually come out of the story smelling of roses either. I may remind you, you were throwing yourself at me that night, so don't get on the high and mighty, holier-than-thou roller coaster. You're as guilty as I am, if not more so. Very well, I won't say a thing, but only for my sister's sake. But if you step out of line for a single minute, I will tell her everything. Do you get it? Back to current day, with Saskia, Pearl's granddaughter. My grandmother had led us into her kitchen. It's as cold and austere as the rest of the house. The flagstone floors are dark. They're complemented by dark mahogany kitchen cupboards. And there's nothing homely about this kitchen, apart from the large cream-range oven that softens the hardness of the dark colours. Even the curtains that align the windows are a dark navy blue, so dark they're almost black. Please sit down, says my grandmother, placing down 3 glass goblets onto the kitchen counter, filling them with ice-cold lemonade. She piles some chocolate brownies onto a plate that she'd bought from the local bakery. Just so you know, she says, breakfast is always at 8, lunch at 12:30, dinner at 7. Of course you can help yourself to snacks in between meals at your will. But a word of warning, I detest any leftovers. I abhor waste of any kind. I grew up in a time when rationing happened here in America. It wasn't as bad as it was in Britain and other places, but we still had coupons, so let's say any waste is something that grieves my heart greatly. Upstairs I have a room in the attic where you can paint or play board games together. But I would appreciate it that when you're in the house, you keep the noise down. I'm an old lady now. I don't appreciate children's shrieks. In the barn outside, I have bicycles you're welcome to use to ride around the countryside. There are lots of lovely walking trails around here, so let me know if you want to take a picnic any time. There's a library upstairs where you can find books to read on the upper floor. And, of course, there's a television room for your entertainment. I don't stand on ceremony here, but I do appreciate punctuality. I'm not good with children, never have been. But if the two of you behave yourself here, we should get on just fine. Now, when you've finished your lemonade, you can find your way upstairs. Your bedroom, Saskia, is pink. I know girls love pink. And your bedroom, Earl, has been painted in green, as it's an earthy colour. It matches the countryside, which I am sure will be agreeable for you. I got a designer to prepare them both for you. Once you've finished your light refreshment, you may unpack your suitcases and put your clothes away in your wardrobe. Also, I would thoroughly appreciate it if you didn't call me grandmother. Such a word reminds me of my age. None of us need to be reminded of that. I'd feel much happier if you would call me Pearl. There, I think I've said all I need to say. I'm now going onto the patio to do some embroidery. I'd prefer not to be disturbed, unless an interruption is very necessary. Me and my brother Earl were delighted to discover that there were 2 rooms in the house that were light and airy, full of promise. These rooms were our bedrooms, which Pearl had graciously had personally decorated for us by a designer. I was exceedingly grateful. It was an escape from the tenebrous darkness of the rest of the house, which did little to inspire me, which was why I preferred the sanctuary of my own bedroom. Maybe that was Pearl's idea, of ensuring that we preferred to remain in our own bedrooms rather than going trumpeting around the rest of the house, like a couple of ungainly elephants. If that was the case, her plan was working favourably. Me and my brother always gravitated to our bedrooms in that large house. My bedroom was done in a very luxurious, dramatic, opulent-looking autumn pink wallpaper, laced with roses, done in a translucent shimmering gold, which gave the room an old-world Victorian kind of appearance. The windows in my room were huge, graced by long flowing curtains with drapes that caressed the oakwood flooring, like the verdant streamers of a willow tree skimming the surface of the water. There was a huge double 4-poster bed, a chaise lounge, a dressing table, and a closet. My brother's room was identical to mine, with exactly the same furnishings, only with more masculine influences. The rich emerald green wallpaper in his room was covered in translucent gold trees, and the shelves of his room boasted models of toy boats and cars that were vintage collector's pieces, possibly worth a bob or two, given the immaculate condition they were in. I think my brother was genuinely chuffed by his bedroom and very enamoured, thankful to my grandmother for going to so much trouble on his account, even though she was detached and emotionally distant towards the both of us, which is not what you'd expect from your traditional grandmother. Much like me, my discerning brother Earl, who never missed anything, perceived that behind my grandmother's prim and proper facade was a woman who was grieving bitterly. We observed that my grandmother did indeed have a gilded, framed picture of my grandfather James in his Air Force uniform on her bedside table, along with a candle that she lit every night to honour his memory. My brother thought it was rather strange that in my grandmother's more youthful days, after James had sadly died, that she'd never got remarried again. "You know," he said, "to me the Second World War was a long time ago. You'd think she'd move on with her life." "Maybe it's not so easy," I'd said. "It sounds like they had a very special love. You can't always replace that." The first few days of living with our grandmother were quite tough. We only rarely got to see her at meal times. It was all terribly formal, with her treating us like glorified guests in her home, rather than her beloved grandchildren. Her demeanour towards us was apathetic, nonchalant and indifferent, and we noted she liked to spend all her time in her own company, and was rarely rather reclusive. One day me and my brother saw a whole new side to our grandmother, almost as if the veneer she had hidden behind for so long
just slipped away. And beneath this mask we saw a beautiful woman who was carrying so much pain that had robbed her life of such joy. It all began when one night, as I was lying fast asleep in my bed upstairs, I was certain I'd heard a strange sound. I sat up very quickly in my bed, with a start, listening very hard, listening very carefully. I knew I'd heard something outside the house, but what? I could hear the distinct sound of feet pressing down on the pebbles, as if someone quite heavily built was walking around my grandmother's front yard. The first discomposing thought that enters my mind is there's an unwelcome prowler meddling around on the property. I decide to investigate. It doesn't occur to me to waken my brother. I think my mind is fueled by a heated inquisitive curiosity. I need to find out who is out there in the yard. My own safety is only an afterthought. My bedroom is bathed in an ethereal light. It cascades across the landing in a soft trajectory. It's very pretty. It means I can slip down the sweeping staircase quite easily. I quickly throw on a dressing gown, wrapping the toweling robe around my middle, and putting on my sheepskin slippers with their rubber soles. I pad down the staircase. My grandmother's bedroom door is slightly ajar, but I can hear her light snores, and I know she's fast asleep. I tiptoe into the main lounge to retrieve the fire poker, hanging on a hook by a very large marble fireplace. I knew my mother had always told me that for a woman a fire poker is a much better tool to use than a rifle, and that's what you should always grab if your life feels threatened. I didn't feel I was in any danger, but it was always better to be safe than sorry. One clap on the head with a fire poker, you could potentially knock the intruder unconscious and call the police. But you couldn't hit them too hard, or you might just kill them. So you had to be careful about that. The pressure you used with the poker would depend on how great the threat was imposed against you. I tiptoed towards the back kitchen door. I figured it would be a noiseless, unobtrusive door to open. It was regularly oiled. I knew this because I saw my grandmother doing it only the other day. If I slipped out the back way, I would not alert the intruder to my presence. I cannot say I felt fear, and I'm not exactly sure why. I followed a natural instinct in my gut, which meant not engaging much thought, but just going with the flow. I needed to find out who the heck was wandering around my grandmother's property. I knew it could be raccoons ferreting around, but I was sure I had heard a sizable man's feet very distinctly, but I was hoping it was just a wild animal. My grandmother kept a night light on around the house, which was useful, as I didn't have to switch on lights to draw any attention to myself. I managed to find a torch in the kitchen cupboard, and before I knew it I'd opened the back door without even a squeak or groan, shutting it silently behind me, until it clicked gently back into place. I could hear the prowler again. Whoever they were, they seemed to be restlessly walking back and forth along a pebbled path, and not really doing their best to be very quiet, which is incongruous, nonsensical behaviour for any intruder, is it not? If they carried on this way, they would almost certainly wake up the rest of the household. I manoeuvred myself stealthily against the wall, creeping along its side, hiding carefully in the dark shadows, clutching on to the walls with my hands. I even switched off my torch. A flurry of cool air blew against my skin, like a ghostly breath. There was a slight nip in the air, but I was used to the cold, so it was of little consequence to me. My shoulder-length dark hair fluttered and twitched against its gentle, gusty spanks. I hadn't reached the corner of the wall yet, and that was when I saw it. I say it because at first I had no comprehension of what I was actually seeing. You must remember I was a New York City girl, brought up in the trendy East Side, and let's just say I wasn't really aware of country life, but I knew enough to tell that whatever this thing was, it wasn't a bear. But what was it? It was monumentally huge, towering at about 8 foot tall, with sturdy humanoid proportions, a graceful, sturdy, robust stance, overlong arms. It was covered in a plethora of long, flowing dark hair. In the tenebrous darkness, I could see only its huge cardboard cutout silhouette, so it was the most intimidating thing that I have ever beheld. It would seem that before fear even entertained my thoughts, an inquisitive, intrigued curiosity just grabbed my attention so fiercely that for a moment fear bounded away, as I marvelled at what the spectral being could actually be, that had so much substance and form, it couldn't be anything outer-worldly or ghostly or even spectral.
What the hell is that? Were my thoughts. A soft shaft of moonlight seemed to answer my question, as if for a brief second accommodating it, when the creature's face was basked in a gossamer light. I could see a square jawline, high cheekbones, hooded deep-set dark eyes, a flat nose, a leathery grey skin, a prominent heavily wrinkled forehead, and then a blazing bright light dawned in my head, and that was when I realised that this idiosyncratic, outlandish creature was almost certainly a Bigfoot. For me, this monumental discovery was nothing short of extraordinary, for it had never ever entered my mind that such a creature like this actually existed. For a moment I drew in a deep breath, holding it for a while, as if diving under the water. I clandestinely watched this creature. He was acting exactly like my dad, when he's got something on his mind that is troubling him, like a very difficult client he's dealing with. He'll walk around our yard at home to find a solution in his head. This is what this creature was doing. He seemed locked up in his own thoughts. He was pacing up and down, up and down, up and down. I knew he was thinking. Sometimes he would rub his hands together. Other times he would scratch his head. He moved up and down restlessly. His gait, for one so large, was remarkably graceful, I have to say. Up and down he paced on the pebbly path, almost with the frustration of a tiger in a zoo enclosure. Then it seemed he'd made a decision. I saw him ferreting around in my grandmother's shrubbery, as if looking for something that he had hidden there. Then he brought out this rather strange bundle. He seemed to move towards our front door. He lowered something on the ground there, although what it was, I couldn't even begin to imagine. The next thing I know is that the creature just glides away. He disappears into the woodgrove and is gone. It's only after he's gone that I have what I can only describe as a delayed shocked reaction. I'm shaking like a leaf. A complete cocktail of emotions just filters through me. Awe, excitement that dominates the flavours of my response. It's an overwhelming sense of astonishment, with a predominant uncertainty, taking central stage, that is interlaced with doubt. Did that just happen? Was I dreaming? When you experience something that is so remarkable, it's easy to convince yourself it's an illusory lucid dream. But I knew this was no dream. This really happened. I'd seen a Bigfoot on my grandmother's property, and my observations of this creature made me mindfully aware of a supreme intelligence. My mind was filled with a reverential awe, that as I made my way back to my bedroom, I trembled like a jelly, not from fear, but just from the gravity of what had actually happened, rather like the aftermath of an earthquake. The ground can involuntarily just shake and tremble. It happened like that to me. Normally I'd be racing to my brother's room, shaking him hard and saying, "Guess what happened? Guess what happened?" But the desire to do that held no appeal to me whatsoever, which was peculiar in itself. I knew it would take me a significant amount of time to assimilate what I'd seen. Rather like a sponge placed in water, it might take a while to soak up all the liquid. It was like that for me, I suppose. The next morning I'm awoken to my grandmother's ear-piercing shrill screams that ring through the house like a resounding bell. When you hear someone scream like that, you react, as did my brother and I. We unhesitantly bound down the sweeping staircase to my grandmother's side as quickly as we possibly could. She's crouching on her hands and knees at the front door. She's holding a human skull in her hands, studying the rows of teeth. There's one gold tooth in the front of the skull, gleaming brightly in the morning light. My grandmother's eyes grow round as saucers. Her scream spills out of her mouth like a tap on full blast that needs to be turned off very swiftly, or it'll flood the entire house. My brother and I quickly dash to her side. We observe a dirty pile of human bones, very faded and very old-looking, wrapped up in a deer hide, lying there at our front door. Both me and my brother look at each other in horror. Someone had placed the human bones there, possibly as some kind of macabre sick joke. But then I remember the reluctant Bigfoot the previous night, who had placed a bundle at the front door. It would seem he was agonizing in making this decision. Why would he leave the bones here like this, I wonder? My grandmother is crying. "I can't believe this is happening all over again. Will this nightmare ever leave me alone? How can this even be after all these years? How can this still be intact? Why isn't it gone by now? It's like the bones are revenging me, refusing to decompose from beyond the grave. It's hounded me all my life, and now it's come back to haunt me all over again.
My grandmother's story. My life since the Second World War had been very hard. No one who'd lived through a war can comprehend what it's like, seeing those you love going off to fight in a war that was so pointless in every regard, but also so necessary for the freedom of our people. I think the punishing hurt I felt was self-induced for so many years. I blamed myself for everything that transpired after my husband's death. Many people assumed that I just never got over my husband's death, that I was a grievous widow who hung on to another time, refusing to move on with my own life. But there was so much more to the story than ever met the eye, that nobody knew about. So many secrets hidden for so many years that had to be buried away, like a stash of squirrels' acorns, never to see the light of day. My state of melancholia was reflected in my lifestyle, in the hard, rigid, dark furnishings that surround me, the foreboding artwork I select to literally hang on my walls, mirroring the dark, dilapidated and broken-down state of my heart. I didn't want to surround myself with pretty things. I felt undeserving of all things good, wilfully denied them to myself. Yet all things that were light and airy were a direct contradiction to my burdened heart, so they became almost offensive to me. It was as if the dark sombreness of my home accommodated and complemented my bleak state of mind. I mean, what does a thunderous, stormy, cloudy day have in common with a sunny one? And what does a happy, joyful, ebullient mood have in common with a sorrowful grief? Nothing. Suffice to say, I was carrying some residual anger towards my late husband James, as the inauspicious day when he told me he was never coming back from the war left an indelible, traumatic footprint on my life that has never faded, not even after all these years. I remember those words. They seared through me like a sharp knife gliding through butter. It was as if he'd plunged this weapon in my heart, for I was flooded with an isolated, lonely, rejected feeling, as if my inner world had become an empty wasteland, filled with prickly cactuses, devoid and barren of all life. I felt empty, alone, desolate. Of course I'd pleaded with him not to go on those flying missions, but he was defiant, determined, resolute, and eager to fight for God and country, and for his children's children, which made him an unsung hero. When I received the news of his grievous death, I was actually more emotionally prepared than most. I also knew he wasn't coming back, with the same conviction that he had conveyed to me that day. Was this God's magnanimous way of graciously making the shock more bearable? Possibly. Nevertheless, I found the grief of my husband's absence in my life insufferable. I felt cheated that my children would grow up without him. I was now left to raise my 2 children on my own with my mother, and of course my stony-hearted sister Amber, who shared our very large Greek revival family home together. Regretfully, my beloved, most wonderful father had passed away shortly after I was married to James, from a sudden unexpected heart attack that caused my family a great grievous upset, with of course the exception of my impervious sister Amber, who rode every storm in life like a skilled surfer on an ocean wave, who didn't allow the rocks on the road of life to cause her to stumble in any way. She would have considered herself a brave heart. In truth, I considered her a ruthless soul. My mother had been so kind and encouraging towards me after my husband's fortuitous death, but regretfully my graceless, unmerciful sister Amber was indifferent and actually quite offensive towards me. It was hard to believe that someone could be that cold-hearted, aloof and obdurate as Amber was, when me and my 2 children were going through such intolerable trauma. But Amber was like a cold fish with an iron heart, who even told my kids to get a grip, to stop being such big babies because they were missing their dad. She was one of those people that told you what she thought without a filter. Sometimes her words could sting, as if you'd been stung by a hive of angry hornets. I've never known anyone more indelicate, more insensitive and hard-boiled than she was. She hypothetically possessed the mouth of a piranha, the spikes of a hedgehog. She knew how to ruffle your feathers more than anyone I've ever known. Besides that, I think she enjoyed stirring the pot. She liked upsetting people. My sister was deceptively pretty, with wispy long blonde hair, curtaining her face in curvy Nordic waves, and a perfectly symmetrical face that probably met the golden ratio. She had exquisite definition in high cheekbones, and of course a pert, elegant nose, a flawless pale skin that had never been besieged by an unfriendly pimple a day in her life. Her dewy blue eyes were seductively pretty. They failed to convey her hard heart, but if you looked closely enough, you could see a stark coldness within them, but then you had to look really closely. She had perfect teeth, along with a gold crown on one of them, but it actually wasn't offensive or ugly. It seemed so many young men were ensnared by her honey traps, like lambs being led to the slaughter. But none of my sister's relationships ever last. Her cruel, cold words would leave men running for the hills, and when I say running, I mean they would run. I remember her complaining once that her relationships with men never lasted, and she couldn't understand why. If I had possessed an audacious courage, I would have told her, like my mother did on numerous occasions, to wash out her mouth and remove the spiky prickles from her heart, like the thorny briars on a thorn tree. I think even my parents were subdued in my sister's presence, as let's just say when you're living with someone with a fisherman's spear for a tongue, you naturally become ever so slightly guarded. Growing up, my parents had tried to raise my sister to be kind and softly spoken, but the more they corrected her, the more she rebelled against their well-meaning corrections. It would seem the lion in some people just cannot be tamed, and that was the case with Amber. After James' death, my sister hit me with a barrage of abuse, when I would have appreciated some kind words, some much-needed encouragement. "Get over it, Pearl," she would snipe, so ungraciously, with a hostile, fierce, reprimanding tone of voice. "For goodness sake, how many times do I have to tell you to get a grip? Look at you. You're a mess, a complete mess. James is not coming back, so move on with your life. Stop this mooching around, feeling so sorry for yourself. Besides, there are plenty more fish in the sea. You're pretty. You'll find someone else to replace James. Why cry over spilt milk? There's no point." "How dare you?" I screamed at her. "I don't want anyone else but James. Don't you get that? You're the one with the problem, Amber. You just lack any empathy or emotion. James was the love of my life." "He's the love of your life, is he? Or he was?" she says scathingly. "For your information, sister dear, I shared a bed with your husband in this house before he ever met you. And we had a very romantic evening together, I might say. And then he just slipped out of the house, dumped me like that. When I saw the loser again, I made sure I gave him a large kick in the groin. He had his fun with me, then he spat me out. That's the man you married, a real jerk." "You're lying," I say, the tears pouring down my face. "James never shared your bed. He wouldn't do that." My sister's grinning at me boldly, basking in my distress like a seal sunning itself on a rock. She's pleased with the upset she's caused me, and is lapping up my obvious horror with delight, as if drinking a delicious cocktail. "Wouldn't he?" she says. "Let's just say, sis, he thoroughly enjoyed every minute of me. Couldn't get enough of me." "Well, if he had such a wonderful time with you, sis, then why didn't he come back for more?" I say unkindly. I'm now so angry. A fury consumes me. I'm like a pressure cooker on the boiler that just wants to burst and explode. I lunge towards my sister, grabbing a handful of her blonde hair and pulling hard. She throws me down on the floor. We wrestle each other like two aggressive dogs, pulling each other's hair. But my sister steps up the aggression several notches. She pounds me with her fist so violently hard that my head begins to spin. My body is shooting pain in places I never knew I even had. My sister is stronger than me. I'm begging her to stop. "Amber, please stop, Amber. You're hurting me. Please, Amber. Please, you're hurting me. Please." My sister does not listen. She doesn't care. She continues beating me. The tears spill down my cheeks. But my sister does not slow down. She beats me so badly that, quite frankly, if she'd continued for much longer, she could easily have killed me, without a shadow of a doubt. Let's just say the fight was brutal. I've never had a physical altercation with Amber before,
but fighting her invited her to become incredibly aggressive towards me. The next thing I know, my mother has entered the room. She's bewildered and confounded about what is going on. My sister has me pinned beneath her. "Stop that now, Amber! You get your hands off your sister now, do you hear me? You stop right now, girl!" My sister ignores my mother's fierce reprimanding tone of voice with a willful insubordination. She continues to pound me with her fists. Every part of me is literally shrieking in pain, as her violent thrusts literally spasm through my body, like fireworks going off on the 4th of July. My mother can take no more. Her protective, nurturing instincts simply roll into gear. She knows she needs to stop this fight before it's too late. She impulsively employs the first weapon to her disposal, a heavy crystal glass vase, which she throws at my sister so hard that it collides with her head like a missile, and my sister just drops on top of me and is out cold as day. My mother pushes my sister's body off me, throwing her arms around me lovingly. "I thought she was going to kill you. Are you all right, sweetheart?" I've never seen Amber behave like this before. I don't know what's got into her. At this point in time, we simply think my sister Amber has been knocked out cold and is unconscious. But when we roll her on her side and try to arouse her, we are met with these hauntingly glazed empty eyes that stare back at us like glass marbles. Me and my mother let out these discomposing screams as we realize the full gravity of what has transpired. Beyond the pandemonium, the sea of shattered glass, my sister's body lies bedraggled, with blood pooling behind her head. In an ocean of chaos, like a dead mermaid, she lies there, with her blonde hair stained red by her own blood. "She's dead!" my mother gasps. "I've killed your sister!" For a long while, all is still in the living room, as we stare at each other in a stunned silence. Time sweeps past us with no regard for this moment, as minutes glide into hours. I've never been quiet for this long, frozen in time from the sheer incomprehensible shock of what has just happened. My mother is the one to break the silence. "No one can know about this, sweetheart. No one can find out what happened here today." I nod in agreement. "You could go to prison for life," I say. "I mean, even if we told the police it was self-defense, I'm not sure they'd believe us. It's a risk we can't afford to take. No one in town will miss Amber anyway. No one will ask questions. No one will even care. She hasn't got friends. People don't even like her. So if we say she went away, that will be that." My mother agreed. Later that day, the two of us buried my sister in the woodgrove, but the guilt that hung over our lives was like a huge curtain of regret. My mother never got over the guilt and the sense of horror she felt about the responsibility of taking her own daughter's life so fortuitously. It was not a surprise that 5 years after the event, my mother also died. The autopsy confirmed a heart attack. I know she died from a broken heart. In the same breath, I was also consumed with a guilt and held myself accountable and responsible for what had happened that day. So every single day of my life, I basked in the shadow of my melancholia, and year after year it clung to me like the mussels on an ocean rock. Then one morning, while my 2 grandchildren had moved into my home for a while, I discovered an unfortunate package on the front doorstep, wrapped in a manky-smelling deerskin. When I opened it, I observed the remains of a human body, a degraded corpse. I lifted up the skull in my hand, observing the long row of teeth, and in the far right-hand corner of the jaw was a golden crown that I recognized. This was my sister's tooth. It was Amber's skeleton that had been burrowed up from the grave. I was completely astonished that the bones hadn't crumbled after so many years, as is most commonly the case, and what you would expect. But the soil conditions can sometimes delay composition significantly, which is why sometimes ancient skeletons have been unearthed by archaeologists dating back hundreds of years, it seems. Well, my biggest concern was that someone knew my secret. So I stood there in the doorway. A strange high-pitched scream wafted through the air. I realized it was coming from me. Back to Saskia, Pearl's granddaughter. My grandmother is trembling in the doorway. Her face is as white as a ghost, and this composed woman allows the reserved mask of her emotional security to slip off her face as she stares in horror at the remains that lie on the front doorstep. I lead her lovingly into the kitchen, while me and my brother watch a tsunami of inconsolable tears gush out of her eyes and roll down her cheeks. But I know these tears are way overdue, and that my grandmother needs to cry, like a barren land tortured by no rain for a long period of time, finally greeted by showers of renewed hope that bring life back to this desert wasteland, inviting promise and the dawning of new opportunities. My grandmother's heart is that desert wasteland. Her tears are the rain. They represent new hope, new life. They need to be cried. And me and my brother do nothing to discourage her. We know it's good for her. It's after her tears have fallen, and the aching weeps of her sobs have finally calmed, that my grandmother tells us the story of her sister Amber, and how she knew they were her remains that had been unearthed. She recognized the golden crown on the tooth. Amber had always loved that crown tooth. I reach out to touch my grandmother's arm. "It was an accident," I exclaim. "If you remember, she was attacking you. She didn't stop. She needed to be stopped. You have to forgive yourself for what happened, as the guilt is eating away at your life, like the moths on a Persian carpet." "But someone," says my grandmother, "knows what happened. They dug up Amber's remains. They're trying to punish me." The someone that dug up the remains was a Bigfoot, I tell my grandmother, who looks at me in astonishment. "Are you kidding?" she pipes. "Do you know, all those years ago, when we dug that grave in the Woodgrove, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The following day we went to place some flowers on the gravesite and to conduct a funeral ceremony, and there were some long sticks sticking out of the grave that we didn't put there. It was very odd." "Well, it seemed like the Bigfoot knew your secret," I say to my grandmother. "Maybe he wanted you to deal with the pain, with what you've been living with for so long, to face your grief, to receive some healing." To cut a long story short, my grandmother reburied her sister's remains in the Woodgrove. We had a private ceremony for her sister, laying fresh flowers at the grave. The next day, some strange sticks had been placed above the new grave. I had a sneaking suspicion that it was from the Bigfoot. After this event, my grandmother's life shifted. The oppressive furnishings were removed from the home. The house was redecorated with lighter fittings and uplifting colours. My grandmother received some professional counselling and lived out the rest of her life in peace. And after her death, the bones of her sister were exhumed and buried next to her gravesite. But by then, the two people involved in Amber's fortuitous death were dead themselves. All these years later, I believe that Bigfoot could sense my grandmother's pain, so deliberately dug up her sister's bones to enable my grandmother to find healing in facing her grief head-on. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.